We will make America great again.
Before it was a superpower, it was an untamed wilderness. Before it became a democracy, it was ruled by kings. Before it was the United States, it was a fractured mosaic of tribes, colonies, and empires.
America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest.
This is the story of rebellion, reformation, resistance, and resilience. A story not of perfection, but of constant correction. Of battles fought not only on bloody fields, but in courtrooms, churches, classrooms, and streets. America was never just a place. It was and remains an idea. An unfinished argument between liberty and control, between unity and division, between who we were and who we claim to be. Let us begin at the beginning, not in 1776, not in 1492, but thousands of years before European sails touched its shores, when the land we now call the United States was home to over 600 sovereign Native American nations, with advanced systems of governance, trade, and diplomacy. From the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast to the Pueblo societies of the Southwest, this land had history long before colonists claimed it. Then came conquest. 1492 ushered in an age of European imperialism. Spain, France, England, each carving out territory. By 1607, the English established Jamestown. By 1620, the Puritans arrived aboard the Mayflower. The land was already inhabited. But the newcomers brought disease, muskets, and a belief in divine entitlement. In the century that followed, 13 British colonies emerged along the eastern seaboard, Virginia to Georgia, governed by Parliament across the ocean, taxed without representation. And by the mid-1700s, the grievances had reached a breaking point. 1775, armed conflict broke out at Lexington and Concord. 1776. The Declaration of Independence was signed, a document stating in writing the birth of a nation, and the moral contradiction that would haunt it. All men are created equal in a country where slavery was legal. The war was brutal, the cost enormous. But in 1783, independence was secured. Then came the Constitution. 1,787, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia. The Articles of Confederation had failed. A new framework was needed. One built on separation of powers, federalism, and a Bill of Rights. 10 amendments defining individual freedoms. Yet again, compromises were made. Slavery was protected. Women excluded. Indigenous nations ignored. From that moment forward, the United States became a battlefield of ideas. In the 19th century, it expanded westward, powered by manifest destiny and fueled by the forced removal and genocide of Native Americans. New territories ignited old debates, slave or free, union or disunion. These questions erupted into civil war, the bloodiest conflict on American soil. 1861 to 1865. The Civil War claimed over 620,000 lives, but the Union held. Slavery was abolished. Yet Reconstruction, the effort to rebuild the South and guarantee black freedom, was violently overturned. By the Jim Crow era, a new system of racial oppression replaced the old. The 20th century made America global. World Wars I and II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, moon landings, presidential assassinations, protests, progress, and political upheaval. 2001. September 11th changed the American psyche. 2020. A global pandemic, racial protests, and political division. 2021. The Capitol stormed, an act unthinkable until it happened. So what is America? Is it the land of the free or a land still becoming free? Is it a democracy or an experiment in democracy? Is it united or merely stitched together by shared myth? This is not just a history of power, presidents, and policies. This is a history of people, of rebellion, of contradiction, of failure and reformation. This is the entire history of the United States, from ancient soil to stolen land, from revolution to Reconstruction, from segregation to space travel, from protests to presidencies, from January 6th to what comes next. Let's begin. Part 1. Before America. Long before the United States declared independence. Long before Columbus set sail from Spain. Long before the words America or New World were ever spoken. There was a continent already inhabited, populated, civilized, governed. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing a land bridge known as Beringia, a vast expanse of tundra that connected modern-day Siberia to Alaska. It is here most scholars agree that the first humans migrated into the Americas, hunter-gatherer bands following mammoths and megafauna across icy plains. They did not come in one wave, but in many, over centuries, perhaps millennia. And they did not stop in Alaska. Over time, they spread across the entire Western Hemisphere, from the Arctic to the Andes, from Newfoundland to the Yucatan. By 12,000 years ago, North America was no longer a frontier. It was a homeland. These were not primitive wanderers. They adapted to every biome: forest, desert, coast, and plain. They farmed, hunted, traded, and formed vast social networks across river systems and mountain ranges. By 1000 CE, complex civilizations had risen across the continent, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the heart of what is now the United States. CAHOKIA, the mound-building metropolis. In what is today Collinsville, Illinois, just east of modern-day St. Louis, rose the city of CAHOKIA, the largest pre-Columbian urban center north of Mexico. At its peak, around 1050 to 1200 CE, CAHOKIA's population was estimated at 15,000 to 20,000, possibly more. Larger than medieval London at the time, it featured over 120 earthen mounds, the largest being Monk's Mound, a pyramid-shaped structure covering 14 acres and standing 100 feet tall. CAHOKIA was a planned city, with a central plaza, defensive wooden palisades, ceremonial platforms, and astronomical alignments. Its people, part of the Mississippian culture, cultivated corn, squash, and beans, used shell-tempered pottery, and conducted long-distance trade that reached as far as the Great Lakes, the Gulf Coast, and the Rockies. The society had a hierarchical political structure, likely led by a chief priest king, blending governance and religion. Ceremonial burial sites reveal elite status and ritual sacrifice. Yet by 1300 CE, CAHOKIA mysteriously declined, possibly due to climate change, resource depletion, or internal conflict. Its ruins remain a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a testament to a sophisticated indigenous civilization that many Americans still know nothing about. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. In the arid mesas and canyons of the American Southwest, the ancestors of today's Hopi, Zuni, and Puebloan tribes built communities into cliffs and carved agriculture into deserts. The ancestral Puebloans, once called Anasazi, constructed great stone cities like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico and Mesa Verde in Colorado, beginning around 900 CE. These sites included multi-story dwellings with hundreds of rooms, kivas, ceremonial chambers built underground, sophisticated irrigation systems to farm in dry environments, trade networks that stretched into Mesoamerica. Their society valued communal living, religious cosmology, and intricate astronomical observation. Structures like Vajada Butte's Sun Dagger marked solstices with precision stone placements. These communities did not collapse, but migrated due to prolonged droughts in the 12th and 13th centuries. Their descendants still live in Arizona and New Mexico, preserving languages, oral traditions, and sacred ceremonies that predate the U.S. Constitution by 1,000 years. The Iroquois Confederacy, a model of federation, In the dense forests of the Northeast emerged one of the most sophisticated political systems of pre-Columbian North America, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy. Formed between 1450 to 1600, the Confederacy united 5, later 6, nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca. Later joined by the Tuscarora, their government was based on the Great Law of Peace, an oral constitution outlining a balance of power among clans, leaders, and tribal nations. Key features included consensus-based decision-making in the Grand Council, the role of clan mothers who nominated and removed male chiefs, checks and balances resembling modern federal structures, emphasis on peace, unity, and collective responsibility. Their influence was not only regional. Founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson studied and referenced the Iroquois system when shaping the U.S. Constitution. Indigenous culture, land ethics, and worldviews. Across the continent, Native peoples held diverse beliefs, but with common principles. Land was not owned. It was revered. It was shared. It was sacred. The idea of individual property rights was foreign and offensive to many Native nations. Nature was not separate from society. Buffalo, rivers, seasons, and stars were integrated into ceremony, survival, and law. Spirituality was lived, not institutionalized. Oral traditions passed down wisdom. Elders were respected. Dreams carried meaning. Identity was tribal, not national. Hundreds of nations, thousands of dialects, each with their own systems of justice, gender roles, governance, and storytelling. From the Salish canoe builders of the Pacific Northwest, to the Comanche horse lords of the plains, to the Seminole resistors of Florida, Native America was not monolithic. It was vast, diverse, dynamic. By the numbers. Indigenous America before 1492. Estimated native population in North America before contact, 7 to 10 million. Over 300 languages spoken across dozens of language families. More than 600 distinct tribal nations, each with unique cultural identities. Thousands of archaeological sites, now buried beneath modern cities, highways, and farms. America didn't begin with Columbus, it began with them. To understand America, we must first understand what it replaced. These were nations, with flags, laws, religions, and territories. They negotiated treaties, fought wars, created art, raised children. They were not prelude. They were not primitive. They were not discovered. They were already here, and still are. Arrival of Europeans, 1492 to 1607. The year that would split the world in half. When Christopher Columbus set sail from Palos, Spain, his goal was not to discover a new world. It was to find a westward sea route to Asia, to China, to India, to the wealth of spices and silk. He sailed under the flag of Castile and Aragon, backed by Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II, Christian monarchs who had just completed the Reconquista by expelling the last Muslim kingdom from the Iberian Peninsula. He commanded 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After 33 days at sea, on October 12, 1492, he sighted a land, an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. He believed it to be Asia. It was not. It was the home of the Taino people, one of many indigenous societies of the Caribbean. Columbus made 4 voyages across the Atlantic. He never set foot on the continent that would become the United States, but his landfall marked the beginning of European colonization, conquest, and devastation. The Spanish conquests, gold, God, and glory. Following Columbus, Spain launched a campaign of imperial expansion across the Americas. The goal was clear: extract resources, convert souls, and expand the empire. Between 1519 and 1533, Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro overthrew 2 of the most powerful civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, the Aztecs and the Incas, using deception, alliances, superior weaponry, and most lethally, disease. In what is now the American Southwest and Florida, Spanish explorers claimed territory through expeditions known as entradas. Key figures included Ponce de Leon, 1513, landed in Florida seeking the Fountain of Youth. Hernando de Soto, 1539 to 1542, explored parts of Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, becoming the first European to cross the Mississippi River. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, 1540 to 1542, searched for the 7 cities of gold, explored the Great Plains, and encountered the Pueblo peoples. In 1565, Spain established St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what would become the United States. It predated Jamestown by 42 years. The Spanish introduced Catholic missions, forced conversions, and the encomienda system, a form of labor exploitation where indigenous people were placed under Spanish control in exchange for Christian instruction and protection. Resistance was constant. In 1680, the Pueblo Revolt, led by a Tewa religious leader named Pope, drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for over a decade. It was the most successful native uprising in North American colonial history. French and Dutch settlements, fur, trade, and strategy. While Spain chased gold, France sought commerce and conversion, particularly through the fur trade. In 1534, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River region, laying the foundation for French claims to Canada and the northern United States. But it was Samuel de Champlain in the early 1600s who established permanent French presence with Quebec, 1608, and developed trade relations with indigenous nations such as the Huron-Wendat. The French didn't conquer, they partnered. Their empire expanded into Louisiana, the Great Lakes, and down the Mississippi River. But their colonial model depended heavily on indigenous cooperation and Jesuit missionaries. Meanwhile, the Dutch, driven by commerce and navigation, created one of the most diverse colonial outposts in the New World. In 1609, Englishman Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, explored what is now the Hudson River Valley, laying claim to New Netherland. By 1624, the Dutch had founded New Amsterdam, later New York City, a bustling port that welcomed traders from across Europe, Jews fleeing persecution, and enslaved Africans. Though their control would later be ceded to the English, the Dutch left an enduring legacy, a thriving tradition of free trade, a relatively tolerant pluralism, and legal innovations that shaped the city that would become the heart of America's financial world. The Great Dying, disease, and devastation of native populations. But the most powerful weapon the Europeans brought was one they didn't even understand: disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity. By conservative estimates, within the first 100 years of contact, 90% of the native population perished, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Entire villages vanished, languages disappeared. Oral traditions were lost before they could be recorded. Scholars refer to this as the Great Dying. It was not a battlefield slaughter, it was biological annihilation. Unintentional, but catastrophic. European colonization wasn't just military or cultural. It was ecological. Horses, pigs, wheat, and cattle were introduced to the Americas. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco were brought to Europe. This Columbian exchange reshaped global diets, economies, and societies, but at a cost measured in millions of indigenous lives. 1492 to 1607, a new world for whom? By 1607, when the English would finally establish their first permanent colony in Jamestown, Virginia, the New World was already in motion, mapped, claimed, and irrevocably changed. Native nations had been decimated, empires had risen, others had fallen, and a vast struggle for dominance, political, spiritual, and economic, had begun. The seeds of conflict, revolution, slavery, and democracy had already been planted. Long before the first American flag ever flew, English colonization begins, 1607 to 1750. On the muddy banks of the James River, in a marshy region the local Powhatan Confederacy called home, 104 English men and boys established what would become the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown, Virginia. It was the beginning of English colonization and the start of a long, often brutal, transformation of the Atlantic coast. Jamestown, 1607, a colony built on failure, then tobacco. Jamestown was not founded by the English crown, but by a joint stock company, the Virginia Company of London. Its purpose? Profit, plain and simple. Investors sought gold, silver, and passage to the Orient. But the men who arrived were ill-prepared. They spent more time searching for treasure than growing food. By the end of the first year, only 38 colonists remained alive. Then came the starving time, the winter of 1609 to 1610. With supply ships delayed, Jamestown descended into famine and desperation. Out of 500 colonists, only 60 survived. There are documented accounts of cannibalism during this period, verified by forensic excavation at Jamestown Fort in 2013. So how did Jamestown survive? One word: tobacco. In 1612, colonist John Rolfe introduced a strain of sweet tobacco from the Caribbean that was well suited to Virginia's climate and well liked in England. By 1617, Virginia exported over 20,000 pounds of tobacco. By 1640, over 3.5 million pounds annually. Tobacco became Virginia's cash crop, a source of immense wealth and dependency. But the crop was labor-intensive. To cultivate it, the English turned first to indentured servants. Indentured servants. The foundation of early colonial labor, indentured servants were poor English, Irish, and Scottish citizens, often criminals, debtors, or orphans, who agreed to work for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to the colonies, food, and shelter. Estimates suggest that by 1700, over 75% of all immigrants to Virginia and Maryland were indentured servants. They built the fields, the houses, the roads. But survival was grim. Up to half of indentured servants died before completing their terms, and once freed, they received a little land or wealth, often joining the lower class, displaced, discontent, and armed. This social tension would later explode in Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, a failed revolt by poor settlers and freed servants, demanding protection from native raids and access to land. That rebellion scared the elite, and from that point on, enslaved Africans increasingly replaced indentured Europeans in the labor system, a shift with consequences that would define American history. Puritans and the Plymouth Colony. While Jamestown grew from economic ambition, Plymouth was born out of religious conviction. In 1620, 102 passengers set sail aboard the Mayflower, fleeing religious persecution in England. They were separatists, later known as Pilgrims, seeking to practice their faith freely outside the Church of England. They intended to settle near the Hudson River within the bounds of Virginia's charter, but storms blew them north and they landed in Cape Cod in present-day Massachusetts. Here, they founded Plymouth Colony. Half died during the first winter, from scurvy, exposure, and disease. But with help from the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Tisquantum, or Squanto, who spoke English after having been enslaved years earlier, they learned to plant corn, hunt game, and survive. The harvest of 1621 would become the origin of the modern Thanksgiving myth, though the reality of settler-native relations was far more complex and often violent. The Mayflower Compact, America's first self-government document. Before disembarking, the Pilgrims knew they were outside legal English jurisdiction, so they drafted a temporary agreement to govern themselves. Signed on November 11, 1620, The Mayflower Compact was a covenant to enact just and equal laws for the good of the colony and to submit to majority rule. Though brief, only 200 words, the Compact is considered a foundational document of American democracy. It marked the first time English colonists explicitly agreed to govern themselves without a royal directive. It laid the groundwork for town meetings, covenant communities, the later formation of colonial assemblies and representative government. The spread of English, colonial governance, and settlement. In the decades that followed, Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by Puritans in 1630 under John Winthrop, who envisioned a city upon a hill, a model Christian society. Connecticut, 1636, Rhode Island, 1636, and New Hampshire, 1638, followed, each with unique religious and political structures. In the South, colonies like Maryland, 1632, and the Carolinas expanded through land grants and plantations. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, would be founded in 1732 as a buffer against Spanish Florida and as a haven for debtors. As the English population grew, so did their footprints. Forests were cleared, rivers claimed. Forts and towns rose. By 1700, there were over 250,000 English colonists on the eastern seaboard, and with them came a new identity, not quite English, not yet American. A new world of contradictions. In the early colonies, we find the seeds of all that would define American history: freedom and oppression, enterprise and exploitation, faith and fanaticism, democracy and dominance, self-rule and servitude, religious freedom and forced conversion, representative assemblies and enslaved labor. This was not yet a country, but the architecture of America, economic, religious, political, was being built. Part 2. The Birth of a Nation. The 13 Colonies, 1607 to 1750. By the mid-18th century, the Atlantic coast of North America was no longer wilderness. It was carved, claimed, and colonized by the English into 13 distinct colonies stretching from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. But these colonies were not identical. They differed in governance, religion, economy, labor systems, and their relationship with the British Crown. To understand how revolution would soon erupt, we must first understand how these colonies were structured and how they began to strain under the weight of empire. Structure and governance. Royal, proprietary, and charter colonies. Colonial America was not a monolith. Each colony was established under a different legal charter, authorized by the Crown. First, royal colonies. These were directly controlled by the English monarchy. Governors were appointed by the king, often with strong ties to London. By 1775, 8 of the 13 colonies were royal: Virginia, New York, New Hampshire. Massachusetts, converted from charter in 1691. North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, New Jersey. In these colonies, governors held executive power, while colonial assemblies, elected by land-owning white men, passed local laws. However, the governor held veto power, and all laws could be overridden by the Board of Trade in London. Second, proprietary colonies. In these colonies, the king granted land to individuals or families, usually to pay off debts or reward loyalty. The proprietors acted almost like feudal lords. Examples include Maryland, Lord Baltimore, a Catholic; Pennsylvania, William Penn, a Quaker; Delaware, originally part of Pennsylvania. These colonies enjoyed greater religious tolerance and more flexible governance, particularly Pennsylvania, which became a refuge for Quakers, Mennonites, and other persecuted groups. Third, charter colonies. These had the most autonomy. Their governance was based on corporate charters granted by the Crown to colonists themselves. Connecticut, Rhode Island. These colonies elected their own governors and legislatures, and their charters functioned almost as constitutions. They operated under the principle of self-rule. a radical idea that would take root and grow into revolution. Slavery begins 1619, the labor system that shaped a nation. In August 1619, a Dutch privateer ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying 20 to 30 African captives. They were traded for provisions and became the first recorded Africans in English America. They were not initially enslaved for life. Some were treated as indentured servants. But by the 1660s, Virginia and Maryland codified hereditary race-based slavery into law. By the early 1700s, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. The southern colonies became economically dependent on enslaved labor. The transatlantic slave trade, known as the Middle Passage, had brought hundreds of thousands of Africans to North America. Conditions were brutal. Forced labor, family separation, whipping, rape, and murder were commonplace and legal. By 1750, there were nearly 150,000 enslaved Africans in the colonies. Southern colonies, particularly South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, thrived on cash crops like tobacco, Virginia, Maryland, rice and indigo, South Carolina, Georgia. These crops were labor-intensive, and profits were built on the backs of enslaved Africans. In contrast, the northern colonies, while not innocent, had fewer enslaved people and focused more on shipbuilding, fishing, trade, and small-scale farming. Slavery still existed, particularly in port cities like Boston, Newport, and New York, where enslaved people worked in homes, on docks, and in artisan shops. Even in the North, slavery was woven into the economy. Rhode Island became a center for the slave trade, building ships used to transport enslaved people. Northern banks and insurance companies profited from Southern plantations. Slavery was not a Southern sin. It was an American institution, legal, accepted, and economically essential. Tensions with Britain grow, the seeds of revolution. Despite geographic distance, the 13 colonies were firmly under British rule. But cracks in loyalty began to show, not from ideology, but from economics and control. Several key developments created growing tension. First Navigation Acts, 1651, 1660, 1663. These were a series of British laws that restricted colonial trade. Colonists could only trade with English ships. Certain products, like tobacco, sugar, cotton, could only be exported to England. All foreign goods had to go through English ports first, even if more expensive. While designed to strengthen British mercantilism, the acts bred resentment and smuggling. Colonists wanted open trade, the Crown wanted control. 2. Colonial taxes and currency limits. England forbade colonies from printing their own money, making it difficult for farmers and merchants to operate. Taxes were levied without colonial representation in Parliament, including Molasses Act, 1733. Taxed imported sugar and molasses. Wool Act, Hat Act, Iron Act. Restricted manufacturing to keep colonies dependent on British imports. Third, salutary neglect and the rise of colonial autonomy. For much of the 1600s and early 1700s, Britain largely ignored strict enforcement of colonial laws. This period is called salutary neglect. As a result, colonies developed independent legislatures. Elected assemblies like the Virginia House of Burgesses, 1619, became powerful. Local control became the norm. When Britain later tightened control, colonists pushed back hard. Fourth Frontier Conflict and British weakness. By the 1750s, British settlers pushed west into native territory. This led to escalating conflict with native nations, who were often supported by French allies. The frontier became a powder keg and would soon ignite the French and Indian War. The American mind begins to form. By 1750, the American colonies spoke English, practiced English common law, considered themselves loyal subjects of the king, but they also had local governments, freedom of religion in many places, freedom of the press, as affirmed in John Peter Zenger's trial, 1735. a growing economy with ties beyond Britain, a belief, slowly forming, that they could govern themselves. The colonies were still English, but different. They were wealthier, younger, more independent, and they knew it. The next spark would come from war, and from that fire, a nation would be forged. The road to revolution, 1754 to 1775. Before the first musket fired at Lexington, before Thomas Jefferson put ink to parchment, before there was a United States, there was a slow burn, a clash of interests, ideals, and identities that took 2 decades to ignite. It began not with rebellion, but with war. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, this global conflict pitted Great Britain against France for control over North America, India, and parts of Africa. In the colonies, it became known as the French and Indian War because British forces and colonists were primarily fighting against French troops and their indigenous allies. The flashpoint, the Ohio River Valley, fertile land claimed by both Britain and France. In 1754, a young George Washington, just 22 years old and serving as a militia officer for the colony of Virginia, led a failed expedition to push French forces out of the region. His defeat at Fort Necessity marked the start of open conflict. The war saw the destruction of Fort Duquesne, later Pittsburgh, the fall of Quebec in 1759, the rise of British naval superiority. By 1763, the British emerged victorious. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, redrew the map. France ceded Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Spain gave up Florida. Britain now controlled nearly all of eastern North America, but the cost of victory was enormous. Britain's national debt doubled from £75 million to over £133 million. To recoup losses, the Crown turned to its colonies, which had grown wealthy and populous during the war. War, debt, taxes, uprising. The British government believed the colonies should help pay for the empire's protection. The colonists, who had no vote in Parliament, saw these taxes as a violation of their rights as Englishmen. The friction began with small acts, but their consequences were massive. The Stamp Act, 1765. For the first time, Britain imposed a direct tax on the colonies. Every newspaper, legal document, marriage license, playing card, and pamphlet required a stamp purchased from the Crown. This wasn't just economic, it was ideological. Colonists responded with the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." Protests erupted from Virginia to Massachusetts. In Boston, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty organized mass resistance, including the public hanging of tax collectors in effigy. The Stamp Act Congress, 1765, marked the first unified colonial response. 9 colonies sent delegates to New York and issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The pressure worked. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate in all cases whatsoever. The Townshend Acts, 1767. Parliament tried again, this time taxing glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Colonists responded with boycotts of British goods, organized by groups like the Daughters of Liberty. Merchants refused to import British products. Women spun homespun cloth as a symbol of resistance. Britain responded with troops. By 1768, British soldiers occupied Boston to enforce order, a decision that would soon turn deadly. The Boston Massacre, March 5, 1770. A tense night, snowballs, ice, clubs. An argument between a wigmaker's apprentice and a British soldier escalated. A crowd gathered. British troops opened fire. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, often remembered as the first martyr of the Revolution. Though John Adams would successfully defend the British soldiers in court, public outrage exploded. Paul Revere's famous engraving, though inaccurate, fanned revolutionary sentiment. Colonial newspapers branded it the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, 1773, and the Boston Tea Party. Britain next passed the Tea Act, designed to bail out the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants. On December 16, 1773, under the cover of night, members of the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea, over 90,000 pounds, worth about 10,000 pounds, into the water. It wasn't a riot. It was a political statement, organized, disciplined, and deliberate. The Intolerable Acts, 1774, punishment and provocation. Britain responded with fury. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, included Boston Port Act, closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. Massachusetts Government Act, dissolved colonial legislature. Quartering Act, required colonists to house British soldiers. Administration of Justice Act, allowed British officials to be tried in England for crimes in the colonies. These laws were meant to punish. Instead, they galvanized the colonies. The First Continental Congress, 1774. In response, 12 of the 13 colonies, excluding Georgia, sent delegates to Philadelphia in September 1774. A unified political assembly for mutual defense. Key figures included George Washington, Virginia; Patrick Henry, I am not a Virginian, but an American; John Adams, Samuel Adams, and John Jay. They issued the Declaration and Resolves asserting colonial rights, a call for non-importation agreements, plans to reconvene if grievances weren't addressed. The Continental Association was created, a framework to boycott British goods and enforce compliance at the local level. The colonies were not yet seeking independence, but they were speaking with one voice, a voice the Crown would soon try to silence by force. The final straws. British troops began seizing colonial gunpowder and weapons caches. Committees of correspondence spread revolutionary ideas from town to town. Militias began drilling in New England villages. A secret network of spies, riders, and rebels emerged. The road to revolution was paved. The people were ready. All it would take was a spark. That spark would come in April 1775, in the towns of Lexington and Concord, where the shot heard round the world would be fired. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. A whisper of rebellion had become a cry, and in the spring of 1775, that cry turned into gunfire. Lexington and Concord, April 19, 1775. British General Thomas Gage, stationed in Boston, received orders to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders John Hancock and Samuel Adams. His troops marched under the cover of darkness toward Concord, Massachusetts. But Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode ahead. They warned the countryside. The regulars are coming out. At dawn, British troops encountered 77 colonial militiamen on the green at Lexington. The commander, Captain John Parker, reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Then, a shot. No one knows who fired it, but history would call it the shot heard round the world. 8 Americans were killed. The British moved on to Concord, where they were met by a much larger militia force. At North Bridge, the colonists returned fire. By the end of the day, the British were in retreat, hounded all the way back to Boston. The war had begun. Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. Over the next year, battles were fought at Bunker Hill, Fort Ticonderoga, and Montreal. Colonial forces under General George Washington laid siege to Boston and forced the British to evacuate in March 1776. Still, many colonists remained uncertain about full independence. That changed with Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776. It sold over 120,000 copies in 3 months and made the case that monarchy was tyranny and independence was a moral imperative. The Second Continental Congress, convened in Philadelphia, voted on June 7, 1776, to declare independence. A committee of 5, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, was appointed to draft the document. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted it. Full reading segment, Declaration of Independence opening. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The document then listed 27 grievances against King George III: quartering troops, taxation without consent, obstructing justice, cutting off trade. The Declaration was both a legal argument and a call to arms. The colonies were no longer British subjects. They were free and independent states. The punishment for signing it? Treason, punishable by death. Key battles of the Revolution. Battle of Saratoga, September to October 1777. The turning point of the war, British General John Burgoyne attempted to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies by invading from Canada. But his troops were surrounded by American forces led by General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold near Saratoga, New York. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered over 6,000 British troops. Why it mattered? It convinced France that the American cause could succeed. It led directly to the Franco-American alliance. Valley Forge, winter 1777-78. In December 1777, Washington's Continental Army made camp at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Conditions were harsh. Over 2,000 soldiers died of starvation, exposure, and disease. Soldiers wore rags for clothing. Many lacked boots. Morale was low, and the army faced desertion. But Valley Forge was also a crucible of transformation. A Prussian officer, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, trained the troops in European military discipline, introducing proper drill techniques, hygiene standards, organizational reforms. By spring, the Continental Army had become a professional fighting force. Battle of Yorktown, October 1781. The final major battle of the war. British General Charles Cornwallis had moved his forces to Yorktown, Virginia, awaiting resupply. Washington saw his chance. He marched his troops south from New York, while French General Rochambeau joined from Rhode Island. At sea, French Admiral de Grasse defeated the British fleet, cutting off escape by water. By October 19, 1781, Cornwallis, trapped on all sides, surrendered 7,000 troops. It was the decisive blow. Though skirmishes continued, the war was effectively over. The French Alliance, 1778. After Saratoga, France formally allied with the United States through the Treaty of Alliance, 1778. France provided troops and officers, notably Lafayette Rochambeau. Naval support that proved critical at Yorktown. Loans and supplies that sustained the Continental Army. Later, Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined the war, turning it into a global conflict against Britain. Treaty of Paris, September 3, 1783. After nearly 8 years of war, peace was negotiated in Paris. American negotiators included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay. The Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States, U.S. borders stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, fishing rights off Newfoundland. The return of Loyalist property, mostly ignored by American states. Britain retained Canada, but relinquished all claims to U.S. soil. A nation is born, and a question begins. With independence secured, 13 sovereign states stood in fragile unity. No president, no constitution, only the Articles of Confederation, a weak alliance, uncertain and unstable. But for the first time, a government founded on popular sovereignty, not monarchy, had prevailed on the battlefield. The idea of America had taken shape. But could it survive? Part 3. A Fragile Union. The Articles of Confederation. The war had ended. The British were gone. But independence did not bring unity. The colonies had fought together, but not as a single nation. They saw themselves as independent states, not provinces of a greater union. The challenge now was clear. How do 13 sovereign entities govern together without a king? The answer, or at least the first attempt, was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, America's first governing document. Drafted in 1777, ratified in 1781, the Articles were written by the Second Continental Congress during wartime. A cautious response to monarchy, meant to preserve liberty by limiting central power. It declared, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Key features of the Articles: no executive branch, no national judiciary, one house legislature, Congress. Each state had one vote regardless of population. 9 out of 13 states required to pass major laws. Unanimous consent required to amend the Articles. Congress could declare war, sign treaties, and coin money, but could not levy taxes, regulate interstate commerce, or enforce laws. This was not a nation. It was a league of friendship, a loose confederation bound more by fear of tyranny than trust in unity. Weaknesses and consequences. The structure proved unworkable almost immediately. 1. Financial paralysis. Congress had no power to tax. It relied on voluntary contributions from the states, most of which refused. War debts mounted. Soldiers went unpaid, sparking protests. Inflation soared due to unregulated currency. Second trade, chaos. Each state had its own tariffs, currencies, and trade laws. States placed taxes on goods crossing borders. Foreign powers, like Britain and Spain, took advantage of the division, refusing trade treaties and occupying Western forts with impunity. Third, no executive authority. There was no president, no single voice to lead diplomacy, respond to crises, or enforce law. Fourth, no national judiciary. Disputes between states had no legal forum for resolution. Conflicts over boundaries, tariffs, and waterways escalated. The Confederation Congress, seated in Philadelphia, then later New York, was little more than a debating society, powerless to solve the crises facing the fledgling country. But the wake-up call would come not from abroad, but from within. Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 1787, a republic on the brink. In the wake of the war, Massachusetts, like many states, was drowning in debt. To pay creditors, the state legislature raised taxes, disproportionately affecting poor rural farmers, many of whom were war veterans. Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain, became the face of growing discontent. Thousands of farmers, unable to pay the taxes in gold or silver, faced property seizures, imprisonment for debt, loss of land and livelihood. In late 1786, Shays and others began forcibly closing county courts to stop foreclosures. They eventually marched on the Federal Armory in Springfield, attempting to seize weapons and spark wider revolt. The federal government could do nothing. There was no national army, no resources. The rebellion was only put down when Massachusetts raised its own private militia, backed by wealthy merchants. To many elites, the rebellion was terrifying. If veterans could rise against the state, if law could be blocked by force, if the government had no power to act, what future did the Union have? George Washington, in retirement, called it little short of a miracle that the people's government had not already been overturned. Thomas Jefferson, watching from Paris, saw it differently. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. Regardless of interpretation, the message was clear. The Articles of Confederation were failing. From Confederation to Constitution, the need for reform. By early 1787, calls for change reached a boiling point. A meeting had already been scheduled in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. But for many, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, revision was no longer enough. What was needed was reinvention. Not of law alone, but of what it meant to be a nation. The constitutional crisis of the 1780s had revealed the flaw of revolutionary restraint. Liberty without order had bred chaos. Independence without unity had bred weakness. What came next would be a second founding, not of rebellion, but of design. The Constitutional Convention, 1787. By 1787, the American experiment stood on the edge of collapse. Shays' Rebellion had laid bare the fragility of the Union. Interstate disputes, trade wars, and foreign threats exposed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. A consensus emerged. A stronger national framework was not only necessary, it was urgent. In May 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, all except Rhode Island, gathered in Philadelphia in what was originally called to revise the Articles. But what they created instead was an entirely new government, James Madison and the Virginia Plan. At the heart of the convention was James Madison of Virginia, just 36 years old, soft-spoken, but widely read and deeply prepared. He arrived with an extensive blueprint, the Virginia Plan, co-authored with Edmund Randolph and supported by George Washington, who had been elected president of the convention. Key features of Madison's proposal: a strong national government superior to the states, a bicameral legislature, 2 houses, based on population, a separate executive and judicial branch. The national government could veto state laws and enforce its own legislation. Large states favored this plan. It gave them more representation based on population, but small states feared being swallowed whole. The Great Compromise, Connecticut Compromise. Tensions ran high until a compromise proposed by Roger Sherman of Connecticut broke the deadlock. This Great Compromise established a bicameral Congress, House of Representatives, seats based on population. Senate, each state, large or small, would have 2 votes. It balanced the needs of both populous and smaller states, and became the core structure of the U.S. Congress still used today. The 3/5 Compromise, slavery and representation. As the convention progressed, a darker compromise emerged. Southern states, where enslaved Africans made up a significant portion of the population, wanted them counted for representation, but not taxed. Northern delegates objected. They argued that slaves, as property, should not factor into political power. The result? The 3/5 Compromise. It stated, all other persons, a euphemism for enslaved people, would be counted as 3/5 of a person for both representation and taxation. This formula boosted Southern representation in the House and Electoral College, cemented slavery deeper into the political structure of the new government, ignored the humanity of the enslaved, treating them as fractions. It was not the last time America would sacrifice moral clarity for political unity, but it would be among the most consequential. The structure of the Constitution. The final draft, completed on September 17, 1787, created a government rooted in checks and balances. Key components: Article 1, Congress, divided into House and Senate, holds legislative power. Article 2, the President holds executive authority, chosen by the Electoral College. Article 3, a federal judiciary interprets the law, led by the Supreme Court. Article 4-7, address state powers, amendments, supremacy, and ratification. The Constitution limited direct democracy. Senators were chosen by state legislatures. Only House members were directly elected. The president was chosen by electors, not popular vote. This was not a perfect democracy. It was a calculated balance between liberty and order. Ratification debates, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. The Constitution was signed by 39 of the 55 delegates present, but it was meaningless without ratification by at least 9 of the 13 states. This sparked one of the fiercest political debates in American history. Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, supported a strong central government, argued it would ensure stability, defense, and economic growth, published the Federalist Papers, 85 essays under the pseudonym Publius, defending the Constitution clause by clause. Key points from the Federalist Papers. Federalist number 10, Madison, warned against the dangers of faction and promoted a large republic. Federalist number 51, emphasized checks and balances and the separation of powers. Federalist number 78, Hamilton, explained the role of an independent judiciary. Anti-Federalists, led by Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Elbridge Gerry, opposed centralized power, feared the Constitution would create another monarchy, demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. They warned, the Constitution creates a government of the few, not the many. The Bill of Rights, 1791, to secure ratification, especially in Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts. Federalists agreed to add a Bill of Rights immediately after the Constitution was adopted. James Madison, once skeptical, now led the drafting effort. By December 15, 1791, the first 10 amendments were ratified. These rights included freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, petition, right to bear arms, no quartering of soldiers in private homes, protection from unreasonable search and seizure, due process, no self-incrimination or double jeopardy, right to a speedy public trial by jury, civil trial rights, no cruel or unusual punishment, rights not listed are retained by the people, powers not given to the federal government belong to the states. The Bill of Rights became the moral spine of the Constitution, turning skepticism into support and resistance into consent. From experiment to nation, in 1789, the Constitution went into effect. George Washington was unanimously elected the first president. America had done what no other nation had: create a functioning republic with written law, elected government, and a framework for peaceful reform in place of monarchy. But this new system would be tested, not just by foreign threats or economic struggle, but by the unfinished business of slavery, expansion, and individual rights. A stronger union had been born. Now it would be challenged, again and again. The early republic, 1789 to 1824. The Constitution was ratified. The United States had a government. But what would it look like in practice? The world watched. Many predicted failure. Instead, what followed were decades of experiment in power, law, diplomacy, and expansion under 4 of the most important presidencies in American history. George Washington's presidency, 1789 to 1797. Unity, neutrality, and warnings. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. There were no political parties, only Washington, the hero of the Revolution, a man of near universal respect. Key actions and precedents under his presidency. The first cabinet. Washington assembled a brilliant team. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. This cabinet system became a model for executive leadership. Hamilton's financial plan. Hamilton introduced policies to stabilize the economy. Federal assumption of state debts. Creation of a national bank, first bank of the United States. Imposition of excise taxes and tariffs. This caused tension with Jefferson, who feared a centralized financial elite. The Judiciary Act of 1789 established the structure of the federal court system, a Supreme Court with 6 justices, circuit and district courts, gave federal courts authority to overrule state courts in constitutional matters. Whiskey Rebellion, 1794. When Western Pennsylvania farmers rebelled against Hamilton's whiskey tax, Washington personally led 13,000 troops to suppress the insurrection, showing that the federal government had both authority and restraint. Neutrality in foreign affairs. In the wake of the French Revolution, Washington refused to take sides between France and Britain, issuing the Proclamation of Neutrality, 1793. His foreign policy principle: avoid entangling alliances. Washington's farewell address, 1796. As he stepped down after 2 terms, Washington delivered a farewell address that shaped American ideology for generations. He warned against political parties, against foreign alliances, against regionalism. It was not law, but it became a kind of sacred doctrine, quoted by presidents for over a century. John Adams, 1797-1801. The Alien and Sedition Acts. John Adams, the Federalist vice president under Washington, became the second U.S. president. A brilliant thinker, but prickly and unpopular, Adams faced immense challenges. The Quasi-War with France, 1798 to 1800. After the XYZ affair, where French diplomats demanded bribes to negotiate with American envoys, anti-French sentiment exploded. Adams refused to declare war, but authorized a buildup of the Navy, the creation of the Department of the Navy, engagements at sea in the Caribbean, the Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798. Passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress, these 4 laws: increased residency requirements for citizenship, Alien Act; allowed the president to deport dangerous non-citizens, Alien Enemies Act; criminalized criticism of the government, Sedition Act. These acts were seen as an attack on free speech and an attempt to suppress Democratic-Republican opposition. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison responded with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, asserting the right of states to nullify unconstitutional federal laws, an early and dangerous test of federal authority. Though Adams prevented war with France, the acts cost him re-election. In 1800, Jefferson won in what became known as the Revolution of 1800, the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties in modern history. Thomas Jefferson, 1801 to 1809. Expansion and judicial power. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration, took office as the first Democratic Republican president. He shrank the military, cut taxes, and emphasized limited government. But his presidency soon tested those principles. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803. From France, Jefferson purchased 828,000 square miles of land, doubling the size of the U.S. price, $15 million. Area, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, acquired from Napoleon Bonaparte, who had lost interest in the Americas after the Haitian Revolution. Though Jefferson questioned the constitutionality of the purchase, he approved it, establishing presidential power in foreign acquisition. It set the stage for westward expansion, conflict with Native Americans, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804 to 1806, a military scientific journey to explore the new frontier, Marbury Asher Madison, 1803. This landmark Supreme Court case, decided by Chief Justice John Marshall, established the principle of judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to strike down laws as unconstitutional. This made the judiciary a co-equal branch of government, a power not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but now central to American law. War of 1812, America's second independence. James Madison, Jefferson's Secretary of State, became president in 1809. Tensions with Great Britain escalated rapidly. Causes of the war: impressment. British Navy kidnapped American sailors. Interference with U.S. shipping and trade. British support for Native American resistance, notably with Tecumseh and the Shawnee Confederacy. American desire to expand into Canada. On June 18, 1812, Congress declared war, the first official war in U.S. history. Key events: British invasion of Washington, D.C., 1814. They burned the White House and Capitol. Battle of Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. Battle of New Orleans, 1815. General Andrew Jackson won a stunning victory after the war had officially ended. Treaty of Ghent, December 24, 1814. Ended the war with no territorial gains, but restored pre-war boundaries. Why it mattered: it proved that the US could stand against a global superpower. Sparked a new wave of national pride and political unity. Crushed native resistance in the Midwest. Ended the Federalist Party, which had opposed the war at the Hartford Convention, seen as unpatriotic. It came to be called America's Second War of Independence. US. By 1824, a new American identity. The early republic had survived a constitutional crisis, rebellion, foreign war, political opposition, economic instability. But it emerged more unified and more ambitious. Slavery, expansion, party politics, and sectional division loomed ahead. But the foundation had been laid. A nation no longer in infancy, but in adolescence. Part 4. Divided, we stand, Age of Jackson and westward expansion. The early republic had survived war, rebellion, and political division. But beneath the surface, deeper fractures were forming. By the 1820s, the United States was changing, growing larger, richer, and more divided. And no figure embodied this new era more than Andrew Jackson, war hero, populist, and 7th President of the United States. The Age of Jackson, 1829 to 1837. Democracy for whom? Andrew Jackson was the first president from outside the Eastern elite. Born poor, raised on the frontier, and known as the hero of New Orleans. He became the face of a new political movement, Jacksonian democracy, a vision of politics driven by white male populism, state sovereignty, and westward expansion. Expansion of suffrage. During Jackson's rise, most states eliminated property requirements for voting, expanding the franchise to millions of poor white men while excluding women, Black Americans, free or enslaved, Native Americans. This was democracy by exclusion, broader than ever, but still racially and socially restrictive. Bank War, 1832. Jackson vetoed the renewal of the Second Bank of the United States, calling it an instrument of elite corruption. He withdrew federal funds and deposited them into state pet banks, destabilizing the economy. This led to the Panic of 1837, a deep economic depression under his successor, Martin Van Buren. But Jackson's most infamous legacy wasn't economic, it was Indian removal. The Trail of Tears, forced removal and ethnic cleansing. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a law authorizing the federal government to relocate Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi to lands in the West. This directly affected the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole. Despite its treaties guaranteeing tribal sovereignty, a Supreme Court ruling in Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, affirming Cherokee rights to their land. Jackson ignored the court, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Trail of Tears, 1838 to 1839. Under Martin Van Buren, U.S. troops forcibly removed over 16,000 Cherokees from Georgia. They were marched over 1,000 miles in winter, with little food or protection. Over 4,000 died from disease, exposure, and starvation. Similar routes were followed by the Choctaw, Creek, and others. The removals continued through the 1840s. It was one of the largest acts of forced migration in U.S. history, now widely recognized as ethnic cleansing. Manifest Destiny. Expansion as divine right. In the 1840s, a new phrase entered the American lexicon, manifest destiny. Coined by journalist John L. O'Sullivan, it was the belief that the United States was destined, by Providence, to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a powerful idea used to justify territorial conquest. removal of native peoples, war with foreign powers, the spread of American institutions, and slavery westward. This ideology transformed U.S. policy and triggered a series of military conflicts. Texas Revolution and Mexican-American War, 1835 to 1848. Mexican-Texas Revolution, 1835 to 1836. Mexico, newly independent from Spain, had invited American settlers into Texas. By the 1830s, Anglo settlers outnumbered Mexican citizens, and many brought enslaved people, violating Mexican anti-slavery laws. Tensions erupted into revolution. 1836, Texas declared independence. Battle of the Alamo, 200 Texans killed by Mexican General Santa Anna. Battle of San Jacinto, General Sam Houston defeated Mexican forces and captured Santa Anna. Texas became an independent republic, and in 1845, it was annexed by the U.S. despite Mexican protest. Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. President James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist, claimed a border dispute with Mexico as cause for war. In truth, the U.S. aimed to seize Mexican territory. Key events: General Zachary Taylor defeated Mexican forces in northern Mexico. General Winfield Scott captured Mexico City. California was occupied by U.S. forces. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. Mexico ceded over 500,000 square miles of land, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. In exchange, the U.S. paid $15 million. Mexico lost half its national territory. This acquisition fulfilled manifest destiny, but exacerbated the slavery debate. Would new territories be free or slave? That question would soon dominate and divide the nation. The California Gold Rush, 1848 to 1855. Just days after the U.S. took control of California, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, near present-day Sacramento. News spread slowly, but when it hit the East Coast and overseas in 1849, the flood began. Key facts: over 300,000 people arrived in California from around the world. These 49ers came from the U.S. East Coast, Latin America, Europe, China, and Australia. Towns like San Francisco exploded in size. California's population grew so rapidly that it applied for statehood by 1850. But the gold rush came at a high cost. Massive environmental destruction, displacement and massacre of native Californians, exploitation of Chinese and Latin American laborers, the spread of vigilante justice and lawlessness. By 1850, California entered the Union as a free state, throwing off the balance of slave versus free in Congress, and setting off a political firestorm. The divide deepens. The age of Jackson and the era of westward expansion made America larger, richer, and more powerful, but also more unequal, more violent, and more divided. Native nations were destroyed. Slavery expanded westward. Political factions hardened. The idea of America was stretching, but something had to give. And what followed was a battle over freedom, power, and morality that no compromise could contain. The rise of abolitionism. By the mid-19th century, the United States had grown into a continental power. But beneath its economic rise lay a deepening moral wound: slavery. And while many accepted its presence, others fought with words, with action, and with sacrifice, determined to end it. This was the rise of abolitionism, a movement that would reshape American conscience and eventually American law. Frederick Douglass, the voice of the movement. Born into slavery in 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland, Frederick Douglass taught himself to read, escaped to freedom in 1838, and emerged as one of the most eloquent voices for abolition in American history. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, 1845, became a bestseller in the US and Europe, exposing the brutality of plantation slavery, the hypocrisy of Christian slaveholders, the deep humanity of the enslaved. Douglass became a renowned orator capable of drawing thousands, a fierce editor and publisher of the North Star, an abolitionist newspaper, an advocate not only for abolition, but black civil rights, women's suffrage, and constitutional reform. He was living proof that African Americans were not inferior, not passive, and not property, but people demanding their place in freedom. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Where Douglass used words, Harriet Tubman used action. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Tubman escaped in 1849, then returned over and over again, risking her life to lead others to freedom. Through the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses, conductors, and code words, Tubman personally led more than 70 enslaved people to freedom and helped hundreds more escape. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. She carried a pistol, not just for protection, but to discourage anyone from turning back, which could endanger the entire network. Tubman later served as a scout and spy for the Union Army and became a national symbol of courage, justice, and moral clarity. Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, a book that moved a nation. In 1852, a white woman from Connecticut named Harriet Beecher Stowe published a novel. It was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold over 300,000 copies in its first year, and over 2 million worldwide. The book portrayed the cruelty of plantation slavery, the breaking up of families, the moral conflict of white Christians complicit in the system. Its main character, Uncle Tom, was not a caricature, but a Christ-like figure who suffered, forgave, and died with dignity. The novel humanized slaves for millions of white Americans who had never witnessed slavery firsthand. Abraham Lincoln, upon meeting Stowe, is said to have remarked, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Whether apocryphal or not, the sentiment was true. The book turned moral neutrality into moral urgency. Bleeding Kansas, 1854 to 1859, when ideology turned to war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, proposed by Senator Stephen Douglas, allowed new territories to decide the question of slavery by popular sovereignty, letting settlers vote rather than Congress decide. This repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel. Result: a violent rush of pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers into Kansas, both trying to control the vote. What followed became known as Bleeding Kansas, Sack of Lawrence, 1856. Pro-slavery forces looted and burned the town. Potawatomi Massacre. In response, abolitionist John Brown and his sons killed 5 pro-slavery men with broadswords. Political leaders were beaten in Congress. Notably, Senator Charles Sumner was nearly killed on the Senate floor for criticizing slavery. For 5 years, Kansas resembled a civil war zone, not a territory. It proved that compromise had failed, and that violence was the new language of the slavery debate. Dred Scott Decision, 1857. Slavery protected by law. In 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down one of its most infamous rulings, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had sued for his freedom after living in free territories with his owner. The court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled black people, free or enslaved, could not be U.S. citizens. Dred Scott had no legal standing to sue. Congress had no authority to ban slavery in U.S. territories. The Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. This decision effectively legalized slavery in all U.S. territories, struck down decades of political compromise, infuriated abolitionists, and fueled Republican opposition. Abraham Lincoln, then an Illinois lawyer, called it part of a pro-slavery conspiracy to nationalize slavery. The nation had now reached a breaking point. The courts could not resolve it. The politicians could not contain it. and the people were preparing for something that had not happened in American history: Civil War. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. By 1860, the United States was no longer just divided, it was fractured, morally, politically, and ideologically. The debate over slavery, state sovereignty, and federal power had reached its inevitable breaking point. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the expansion of slavery, was the final spark. Secession of the South, 1860 to 1861. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, without carrying a single Southern state. Just 6 weeks later, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. In rapid succession, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. By February 1861, these states formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as president, and adopted a constitution that explicitly protected slavery. Lincoln refused to recognize secession as legal. In his first inaugural address, March 1861, he declared, "The Union is unbroken. We are not enemies, but friends." But the South had already begun seizing federal property, including forts, arsenals, and mints. Fort Sumter and the outbreak of war. April 12, 1861. The flashpoint came in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Fort Sumter, a federal fort, was surrounded by Confederate troops. When Lincoln attempted to resupply it, Confederate artillery opened fire at 4:30 a.m., April 12, 1861. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. No one died in the attack, but the war had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. In response, 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. The Union now had 23 states, the Confederacy 11. What followed was the deadliest war in American history. Major battles: Antietam, Gettysburg, and Appomattox. Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862. Fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, it was the single bloodiest day in U.S. military history. Over 22,700 casualties. Though tactically inconclusive, it halted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North and gave Lincoln the momentum to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863. Following Antietam, Lincoln shifted the war cost of the Civil War, over 620,000 deaths, roughly 2% of the U.S. population. Billions in property destroyed, especially in the South. 4 million enslaved people freed. The 13th Amendment, passed later in 1865, formally abolished slavery in the United States. But the end of the war was not the end of the conflict. Freedom had come, but justice had not. What followed was Reconstruction, a struggle to rebuild the South, restore the Union, and define what freedom truly meant. Part 5. Rebuilding and Industrializing America. Reconstruction Era, 1865 to 1877. The guns fell silent in 1865. The Union had survived. Slavery was abolished. But what kind of country would emerge from the ashes? Reconstruction was not just about rebuilding the South. It was about redefining freedom, citizenship, and democracy in the United States. For 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, America tried to answer a question it had long evaded. What does equality really mean? The Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th. In the wake of war, Congress passed 3 constitutional amendments, known as the Reconstruction Amendments, designed to fundamentally reshape the legal status of formerly enslaved people. 13th Amendment, ratified December 6, 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. This amendment abolished slavery, not just in the rebellious states, but nationwide. It ended legal bondage, but not oppression. 14th Amendment, ratified July 9, 1868. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. It established birthright citizenship, equal protection under the law, due process protections, a guarantee that state governments could not deny civil rights. This amendment was revolutionary, turning the Constitution into a tool of inclusion, not exclusion. It was also fiercely resisted in the South. 15th Amendment, ratified February 3, 1870. The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This gave black men the legal right to vote and ushered in a wave of black political participation. During Reconstruction, over 2,000 black men held public office, from local sheriffs to U.S. Congress. Hiram Revels, Mississippi, became the first African-American U.S. Senator in 1870. But paper rights did not stop political violence. The Freedmen's Bureau, 1865 to 1872. Created by Congress in March 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was the first federal welfare agency in U.S. history. Its mission? Provide food, clothing, and medical care to war refugees, help formerly enslaved people negotiate labor contracts, reunite families separated by slavery, establish schools, legal support, and land access. The Bureau built over 4,000 schools, including Howard University and Fisk University. But its reach was limited. It was underfunded, undermanned, and opposed by white Southerners. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, vetoed many of its powers, only to be overridden by Congress. Despite its flaws, the Freedmen's Bureau was a critical step in turning freedom into reality, if only briefly. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and white reaction. As black Americans gained legal rights and political power, white supremacists launched a violent counter-revolution. The most infamous group, the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. Led by former Confederate officers, the Klan used terrorism to suppress black advancement. Nighttime raids, beatings, lynchings. Attacks on black schools, churches, and polling places. Intimidation of white Republicans and carpetbaggers, Northerners who moved south to aid Reconstruction. Congress responded with Enforcement Acts, 1870 to 71, giving federal government the power to prosecute Klan violence. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, allowing the president to use military force and suspend habeas corpus in areas where civil rights were being denied. President Ulysses S. Grant used these laws to temporarily crush the Klan, but white resistance never fully ended. It simply evolved. In place of open violence came Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, and racial segregation, a new system of oppression dressed in legal clothes. Compromise of 1877, the end of Reconstruction. By the 1870s, white Southern Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, had regained control of many state governments. Meanwhile, the North grew weary of the fight. Economic depression, political corruption, a rising focus on Western expansion and industry. In 1876, the presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, and Samuel Tilden, Democrat, ended in crisis. Tilden won the popular vote, but 20 electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were disputed. To resolve the standoff, both parties agreed to the Compromise of 1877. Hayes would become president. In return, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, ending Reconstruction, officially and abruptly. With the soldiers gone, so too was protection for black voters, officials, and communities. What followed was nearly a century of racial apartheid, disenfranchisement, and state-sponsored segregation. Reconstruction's legacy. Reconstruction failed to deliver lasting racial justice, but it planted constitutional seeds that would grow generations later. The 14th and 15th Amendments would be used in Brown versus Board, Voting Rights Act, and civil rights movements. The fight for equality would be revived, not erased. But for millions of Black Americans, the promises of freedom, land, education, safety, political power were stripped away before they were ever secured. Reconstruction was the first civil rights movement. Its failure was not inevitable, it was a choice. And America would spend the next 100 years dealing with its consequences. The Gilded Age, 1877 to 1900. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, a new chapter began, not of reunification, but of rapid transformation. This was the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, describing a period glittering on the surface, but corrupt underneath. It was an age of unprecedented industrial growth, monumental wealth, mass immigration, and deep inequality. The United States became the world's leading industrial power, but behind every booming factory, rail line, and skyscraper stood a complex story of labor, exploitation, and political manipulation. The industrial boom. Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. From 1870 to 1900, the U.S. economy more than quadrupled. Fueled by coal, steel, railroads, oil, and new technology, the country became a global economic giant. Andrew Carnegie, Steel. A Scottish immigrant who built Carnegie Steel, based in Pittsburgh, used vertical integration, owning every step of the production process, from raw materials to distribution. By 1901, he sold his company to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, the equivalent of over $17 billion today. Carnegie later devoted his fortune to philanthropy, funding libraries, universities, the arts. But his workers toiled long hours for low wages. John D. Rockefeller, Oil, founded Standard Oil Company in 1870, used horizontal integration, buying out competitors to control over 90% of U.S. oil refining, developed trusts and holding companies to bypass antitrust laws. By 1900, he was the richest man in American history, worth an estimated $400 billion in today's dollars. Rockefeller gave away over half his fortune, but also crushed unions, manipulated railroads, and wiped out smaller businesses. J.P. Morgan, Finance and Consolidation, a powerful banker who financed railroads, steel, and electricity. Created U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation. Personally bailed out the U.S. government in 1895, lending gold to stabilize the economy. Morgan wasn't an industrialist. He was a consolidator, amassing control over vast sectors of the economy. Together, these captains of industry, or robber barons, depending on perspective, concentrated more wealth than any class in history, shaping corporate capitalism as we know it. Immigration waves and Ellis Island. To feed the industrial machine, America needed labor, and millions came to provide it. Between 1880 and 1920, over 23 million immigrants arrived in the U.S., the largest migration in American history. Who came? Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, Hungarians. Irish and Germans continued to arrive in large numbers. Chinese, despite exclusion efforts, also entered through West Coast ports. Ellis Island opened 1892. Located in New York Harbor, Ellis Island became the primary federal immigration station, processed up to 12,000 people per day. Immigrants underwent medical exams, name documentation, and legal screening. Over 12 million people passed through its gates by 1954. Immigrants settled in urban ethnic enclaves, Little Italy, Chinatown, Jewish Lower East Side, bringing culture, language, and labor to American cities. But they faced discrimination, low wages, dangerous working conditions, and a rising wave of nativism, labor strikes, child labor, and working conditions. While tycoons made fortunes, workers endured brutal conditions. 10 to 12-hour workdays, 6 days a week. No job security, no benefits, and frequent injuries. Child labor was rampant. Over 1.7 million children under 16 worked in mines, factories, and mills by 1900. Major labor uprisings, the Great Railroad Strike, 1877, began in West Virginia, spread nationwide, halted 2/3 of U.S. rail traffic. Federal troops killed over 100 strikers. Haymarket Riot, 1886, a peaceful protest in Chicago turned violent after a bomb killed 7 police. 8 anarchists were convicted, 4 were executed. Homestead Strike, 1892. At Carnegie Steel, workers protested wage cuts. A battle with Pinkerton guards left 9 strikers dead. Pullman Strike, 1894. National Rail Strike, led by Eugene 5 Debs. Federal troops broke it up. 30 were killed. These events fueled the rise of labor unions like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, AFL. The beginning of the fight for safer conditions, child labor laws, and collective bargaining. Corruption and political machines, the shadows of democracy. Beneath the skyscrapers and steel was another force, urban political machines, informal power structures that controlled city politics through patronage, bribery, and fraud. Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. In New York City, the most notorious machine was Tammany Hall, led by William Boss Tweed. Tweed controlled judges, police, and elections, embezzled between $30 to $200 million from taxpayers through inflated contracts and kickbacks, built city parks, infrastructure, and helped immigrants in exchange for votes. He was finally exposed by Thomas Nast, a political cartoonist whose illustrations appeared in Harper's Weekly. Tweed was arrested, tried, and died in prison in 1878. But the machine system endured. In Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco, machines traded jobs for loyalty and turned democracy into patronage. A complex legacy. The Gilded Age made America, an industrial powerhouse, a melting pot of immigration, a nation of billionaires and beggars, innovation and inequality. It left behind a working class ready to fight, a political system ripe for reform, and a population beginning to ask, if this is progress, progress for whom? The pressure would lead to the Progressive Era, a national reckoning with corruption, corporate power, and social justice. American Imperialism, 1890s to 1918. By the late 19th century, the United States had conquered the frontier, dominated the continental interior, and built the world's largest industrial economy. Now, American ambition turned outward. This was the age of imperialism, when major powers competed for colonies, markets, and naval dominance. For the first time, the U.S. sought to expand beyond its borders, not just with trade, but with territory, military force, and ideology. The result was a sharp shift from isolation to intervention, and a defining moment in America's global role. The Spanish-American War, 1898. The catalyst came from the declining Spanish Empire, which still held colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, most notably Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In Cuba, revolution had erupted in the 1890s. Spanish forces responded with brutal repression, placing over 300,000 civilians in concentration camps, where tens of thousands died. American newspapers, led by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, used yellow journalism to sensationalize Spanish atrocities, stirring public outrage. Then, on February 15, 1898, the U.S. battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. Though the cause was never definitively proven, headlines screamed, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Congress declared war in April 1898. Key facts: war lasted only 113 days. U.S. forces defeated Spain decisively in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Future President Theodore Roosevelt gained fame leading the Rough Riders at the Battle of San Juan Hill. The war marked the first time the U.S. fought overseas for control of foreign territory. Treaty of Paris, 1898. Spain ceded Puerto Rico. Guam, the Philippines, sold for $20 million. Cuba became independent, but under U.S. control via the Platt Amendment, which allowed US military intervention and naval bases, like Guantanamo Bay. It was America's arrival as a colonial empire, once against monarchy, now in possession of colonies itself. US annexation of Hawaii, the Philippines, and Guam, Hawaii, annexed 1898. American missionaries and sugar planters had exerted power in Hawaii since the 1820s. In 1893, US-backed planters overthrew Queen Liliuokalani, ending native monarchy. The islands were annexed by the US in 1898 against the will of the native population. In 1900, Hawaii became a US territory. Its strategic location in the Pacific made it a key naval base, later home to Pearl Harbor. Philippines. After defeating Spain, the US took control of the Philippines, but Filipinos who had fought for independence resisted. Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902. Led by Emilio Aguinaldo, Filipino fighters launched a guerrilla war. US forces responded with scorched earth tactics, mass arrests, and civilian concentration zones. Over 200,000 Filipino civilians and 4,000 US soldiers died. Despite brutality, the US maintained control until Philippine independence in 1946. Guam, captured by US forces during the Spanish-American War, became a permanent US naval base crucial for control over the Western Pacific. Remains an unincorporated US territory today. These new territories marked America's transition from a continental power to a global one, able to project force across oceans and influence events worldwide. Panama Canal Engineering Empire, 1904 to 1914. With new territories in the Atlantic and Pacific, the US needed a faster way to move its navy and goods between oceans. Solution: a canal through Central America. The challenge: Panama was a province of Colombia. The US offered Colombia $10 million for canal rights. They refused. In response, Theodore Roosevelt supported a Panamanian Revolution, which succeeded in 1903. Within weeks, the new Republic of Panama signed a treaty granting the US control of the Canal Zone. Construction began in 1904. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history. Took 10 years, involved over 40,000 workers, faced deadly challenges: malaria, yellow fever, landslides. Over 5,600 workers died, many of them West Indian laborers, who received lower pay and endured worse conditions than white workers. The canal opened on August 15, 1914, just as World War I began in Europe. It shortened naval travel by over 8,000 miles, cemented US military and commercial dominance in the Western Hemisphere, marked Roosevelt's bold foreign policy vision: speak softly and carry a big stick. The Age of American Empire. By 1914, the United States controlled island colonies across the Pacific and Caribbean, held military bases from Manila to San Juan, could move its navy between oceans in days, had joined the ranks of imperial powers alongside Britain, France, Germany, and Japan. But this power came at a cost. Native populations were often subjugated or displaced. Democratic ideals were contradicted by colonial rule. Resistance movements in occupied lands questioned whether liberty was truly America's aim. This was the birth of American global strategy, a vision of the US as both a guardian of freedom and a holder of empire. The century ahead would test which identity would prevail. Part 6. America and the World. World War I, 1914 to 1918. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States had become a global economic and military power, but it remained, at least officially, reluctant to intervene in foreign wars. That changed with the outbreak of World War I, a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen. Fought from 1914 to 1918, the war would kill over 16 million people, destroy empires, redraw borders, and permanently change global politics. At first, the United States watched, then it entered and helped decide the outcome. Woodrow Wilson's neutrality, Lusitania, declaration of war. When war erupted in July 1914, the major powers of Europe divided into Allied powers, France, Britain, Russia. Central powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Ottoman Empire. President Woodrow Wilson declared American neutrality, urging citizens to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. But neutrality was tested early. The US sold weapons and supplies to Britain and France. German U-boats began unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting all ships near the British Isles, including civilian vessels. The Lusitania, May 7, 1915. A British ocean liner, the Lusitania, was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. 1,198 people died, including 128 Americans. Germany claimed the ship carried munitions, which it did, but public opinion in the US turned sharply against Germany. Wilson remained neutral, but warned Germany against further attacks. Final straws and entry into war. By 1917, several key events ended American patience. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening American shipping. The Zimmermann Telegram, January 1917, a secret German message proposing a military alliance with Mexico if the US entered the war. In exchange, Mexico would recover Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The message was intercepted and published, enraging the American public. German U-boats sank several American ships, including the Algonquin and Illinois. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, stating, "The world must be made safe for democracy." 4 days later, the US officially entered World War I. Trench warfare, Meuse-Argonne, Harlem Hellfighters. The war had settled into a brutal stalemate in Western Europe, defined by trench warfare. Soldiers lived in muddy trenches, exposed to artillery, gas, and disease. Between enemy lines was no man's land, often littered with bodies and barbed wire. US mobilization, over 4 million Americans served. 2 million were deployed to Europe. Led by General John J. Pershing, the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, fought under U.S. command. Meuse-Argonne Offensive, September-November 1918, the largest battle in American history to that point. Over 1.2 million U.S. soldiers participated. 26,000 Americans killed, 95,000 wounded. Helped break the German lines and force the request for armistice. Harlem Hellfighters. The 369th Infantry Regiment, an all-black unit from New York, served with distinction under French command because American units were still segregated. They had spent 191 days in combat, longer than any US unit, earned France's Croix de Guerre for heroism, returned as heroes but faced racism at home, a contradiction that would fuel future civil rights struggles. Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, 1919. Germany requested an armistice on November 11, 1918, now commemorated as Veterans Day in the US. But peace would not come easily. The Paris Peace Conference, 1919. World leaders, the Big Four, met to draft terms. Woodrow Wilson, US. David Lloyd George, Britain. Georges Clemenceau, France. Vittorio Orlando, Italy. Wilson presented his 14 points, a plan for lasting peace, including open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, reduction of arms, self-determination for nations, creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But Britain and France wanted revenge, not reconciliation. Treaty of Versailles, June 28, 1919. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war guilt clause, pay $33 billion in reparations, surrender colonies and territory, severely limit its military. The League of Nations was established, with a charter based largely on Wilson's U.S. Senate rejection. Many senators, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, feared that the League would drag America into foreign wars without congressional approval. Despite Wilson's national speaking tour, The Senate rejected the treaty, not once, but 3 times. The United States never joined the League and signed a separate peace with Germany in 1921, legacy of World War I. Over 116,000 Americans died from combat, disease, and wounds. The US emerged as a global financial and military power. The war redrew borders, collapsed empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, German, and sowed the seeds of World War II. At home, returning black veterans fueled a growing call for civil rights, while women who served on the home front intensified demands for suffrage. And although Wilson had dreamed of lasting peace, the war left behind a world of anger, ruin, and unfinished justice. The United States, now awakened to its power, began the 1920s with cultural confidence, economic growth, and looming instability. The Roaring Twenties, 1920 to 1929. The First World War had ended, the economy surged, technology raced forward, morality bent and broke, and the United States entered a decade of breathtaking contradiction, prosperity and poverty, freedom and fear, progress and prejudice. This was the Roaring Twenties, a period of social revolution, economic boom, cultural expression, and looming collapse. The Jazz Age, flappers, and the Harlem Renaissance. The decade opened with a new sound, jazz, born in the black communities of New Orleans, but exploding nationwide through radios, phonographs, and speakeasies. Musicians like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith redefined music with improvisation, rhythm, and emotional intensity. Nightclubs like the Cotton Club in Harlem attracted white audiences, even as segregation persisted. The Harlem Renaissance. Centered in Harlem, New York, this cultural movement saw black poets, authors, and intellectuals assert their identity through art and politics. Figures included Langston Hughes, poet of black life and jazz rhythm; Zora Neale Hurston, author of Their Eyes Were Watching God; Alain Locke, philosopher of the New Negro movement. It was not just art, it was resistance through culture, flappers and the modern woman. Women challenged Victorian norms with shorter skirts, bobbed hair, public smoking, and dancing. They were dubbed flappers, a new image of freedom, rebellion, and individuality. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote after nearly a century of struggle. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers, enrolled in universities, and began redefining public life. Prohibition and organized crime. Despite social liberation, the 1920s also saw a major effort to impose moral order. In 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, launching Prohibition, the nationwide ban on manufacture, sale, transportation of alcoholic beverages. The Volstead Act provided enforcement, but Americans found ways around it. Prohibition didn't stop drinking, it drove it underground. Speakeasies and bootleggers, thousands of illegal bars, speakeasies, operated across cities. Bootleggers smuggled liquor across borders, often with the help of corrupt officials. Homemade bathtub gin became a dangerous staple. Rise of organized crime. Criminal empires flourished, led by figures like Al Capone in Chicago, Meyer Lansky in New York, Lucky Luciano, architect of the American Mafia. Capone controlled a $60 million empire of alcohol, gambling, and protection rackets. Violence soared, with over 500 gang-related murders in Chicago alone during the decade. The government was outgunned, underfunded, and overwhelmed. Prohibition would last until 1933, but its legacy shaped law enforcement and crime for decades. The stock market boom and crash. The 1920s were also a decade of unprecedented economic growth. Industrial production soared. Automobiles. By 1929, over 26 million cars were on American roads, 1 for every 5 people. Electricity and appliances transformed middle-class homes. Consumer credit became widespread. Americans bought on installment. The stock market, once a domain of the wealthy, became a symbol of prosperity. Ordinary citizens began investing. Speculation skyrocketed. Brokers allowed investors to buy on margin, paying only a fraction of the cost up front. Between 1921 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average quadrupled. But beneath the boom were cracks. Wages did not keep pace with profits. Farming remained in depression. The economy was dependent on credit and speculation. On October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market collapsed. $14 billion lost in a single day. By mid-November, the market had lost over $30 billion. Thousands of banks failed. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, homes, and savings. The Roaring Twenties ended in silence, replaced by lines of unemployed men, closed factories, and falling markets. It was the beginning of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, 1929 to 1941. The crash of October 1929 was not just a financial failure. It was the beginning of the most severe economic crisis in American history. Over the next 12 years, the Great Depression would impact every home, every city, and every industry, collapsing banks, drying up farms, and pushing millions into poverty. This was not just an economic downturn, it was a national unraveling, and a test of whether democracy could survive despair. The Dust Bowl, America's ecological disaster. In the 1930s, a decade-long drought swept across the Great Plains, hitting states like Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico the hardest. Combined with years of overfarming, deforestation, and lack of soil conservation, this created one of the worst environmental catastrophes in American history. What followed? Massive dust storms, known as black blizzards. Dust blew as far as New York City and Washington, D.C. Over 3.5 million people abandoned their farms. Many headed west to California. These migrants, often called Okies regardless of origin, faced discrimination, poverty, and grueling labor in fields and orchards. Author John Steinbeck immortalized their journey in The Grapes of Wrath, 1939, exposing the human toll of environmental neglect and economic collapse. Hoovervilles, the face of American poverty. In the wake of the crash, unemployment skyrocketed. By 1933, 25% of Americans were out of work. Industrial production had dropped by half. 9,000 banks failed. People lost their homes, farms, and life savings. Across the country, the homeless built makeshift shanty towns on public land, dubbed Hoovervilles, a bitter reference to President Herbert Hoover, whose policies were seen as inadequate and indifferent. These settlements appeared in New York's Central Park, the banks of the Potomac River in D.C., outskirts of cities like Seattle, St. Louis, and Chicago. Soup kitchens and bread lines stretched for blocks. Children dropped out of school to find work. Hobos, unemployed men, rode freight trains across the country in search of jobs. Hoover's response emphasized volunteerism, business cooperation, balanced budgets. But his refusal to provide direct federal aid deepened the crisis. In 1932, thousands of World War I veterans marched on Washington as the Bonus Army, demanding early payment of promised wartime bonuses. Hoover ordered them removed. The Army used tear gas and tanks. It was a turning point. In November 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide, promising a New Deal for the American people. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs. 1933 to 1939. FDR entered office on March 4, 1933. As banks were failing daily and millions faced starvation. His strategy was bold, experimental, and federal. Within the first 100 days, Roosevelt launched a sweeping series of programs, forever changing the relationship between Americans and their government. Immediate Relief and Banking Reform, Emergency Banking Act, March 1933. Closed all banks temporarily, reopened only the solvent ones. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, insured individual bank deposits, restored trust in banking. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, regulated Wall Street and protected investors. Job creation programs, Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, hired over 3 million young men to plant trees, build parks, and conserve natural resources. Works Progress Administration, WPA, employed over 8 million people to build roads, schools, post offices, and bridges, also funded artists, writers, and musicians. Public Works Administration, PWA, constructed large-scale infrastructure, including dams, tunnels, and hospitals. Support for industry, farmers, and labor. Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, paid farmers to reduce production, aimed to raise crop prices. National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, set wages and hours, encouraged collective bargaining. Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, brought electricity, flood control, and jobs to one of the poorest regions in the country. Social safety nets. Social Security Act, 1935, provided pensions for the elderly. Unemployment insurance, aid to disabled individuals and dependent children. It was the first federal retirement system and remains a cornerstone of American social policy. Results and legacy. The New Deal didn't end the Depression, but it alleviated suffering, modernized the economy, and restored national confidence. Roosevelt was re-elected 3 more times, becoming the longest-serving president in U.S. history. Still, the New Deal had critics. Conservatives saw it as government overreach. Business leaders opposed labor protections and regulation. Some progressives felt it didn't go far enough to help the poor and address racism. Nevertheless, it established a federal responsibility for economic welfare, a precedent that would shape the 20th century. The road to World War II. As the Depression lingered into the late 1930s, the world darkened again. Fascist regimes rose in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Hitler rearmed Europe. The US clung to isolationism, passing neutrality acts and avoiding foreign entanglements. But by 1941, global conflict would again draw the United States onto the world stage, and the Depression would be eclipsed by the largest war in human history. Part 7. The American Century. World War II, 1939 to 1945. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, launching the second great global war of the 20th century. Within months, France had fallen, Britain stood alone, and much of the world braced for catastrophe. For the first 2 years, the United States watched, armed, anxious, but officially neutral. That would change in a single morning. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. On a quiet Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 350 Japanese aircraft attacked in waves. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. More than 2,400 Americans killed. Over 1,100 wounded. Among the destroyed was the USS Arizona, which exploded with over 1,000 men still aboard. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. America was officially in World War II. D-Day, Midway, and the Pacific Theater. Battle of Midway, June 4 through 7, 1942. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy ambushed and decisively defeated the Japanese fleet near Midway Atoll. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers destroyed. Hundreds of planes and pilots lost. The tide of the war in the Pacific began to turn. This victory was due in part to American codebreakers who intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications. D-Day, Normandy Invasion, June 6, 1944. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, over 156,000 Allied troops, American, British, Canadian, landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. Operation Overlord was the largest amphibious invasion in history. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Intense German resistance, especially at Omaha Beach. Over 4,000 Allied deaths on the first day alone. Within weeks, Allied forces liberated Paris and began pushing east toward Germany. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi control in Western Europe. Island hopping in the Pacific, American forces fought a brutal campaign across the Pacific. Guadalcanal, 1942–43. Iwo Jima, 1945. U.S. Marines raised the flag atop Mount Suribachi in an iconic photo. Over 6,800 Americans killed. Okinawa, April–June 1945. Bloodiest Pacific battle, with over 12,000 U.S. deaths and 100,000 plus Japanese military and civilian casualties. Japanese resistance was fierce, often suicidal, with kamikaze attacks and civilians ordered to die rather than surrender. An invasion of mainland Japan was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Internment camps, a violation of freedom. Following Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese sentiment surged across the U.S. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forcible relocation of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, to internment camps. Families were uprooted from homes in California, Oregon, Washington, held in remote camps under armed guard, Manzanar, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain, among others. Lost homes, businesses, land, and dignity. In 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized through the Civil Liberties Act, acknowledging the act as a grave injustice rooted in racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and political failure. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The nuclear age begins. By August 1945, Germany had surrendered, but Japan refused to. President Harry S. Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, faced a decision: invade or end the war with a new weapon. The Manhattan Project, a top-secret program to develop an atomic bomb. Directed by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, tested successfully on July 16, 1945 in the New Mexico desert. Bombings, August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, bomb name, Little Boy. 70,000 to 80,000 killed instantly. Tens of thousands more from radiation. August 9, 1945. Nagasaki, bomb name, Fat Man. 40,000 killed instantly, followed by destruction of infrastructure and long-term illness. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. The bombings remain controversial, debated for hastening the end of the war, preventing massive casualties from invasion, but at the cost of civilian annihilation and nuclear precedent. The founding of the United Nations, 1945. In the aftermath of two world wars, leaders sought to prevent future global conflict through international cooperation. In April 1945, delegates from 50 nations met in San Francisco to draft the United Nations Charter. Key principles: maintain international peace and security, promote human rights and self-determination, encourage economic and social development. The U.S. played a central role, hosting the UN headquarters in New York City and joining as a founding member. The United Nations replaced the failed League of Nations, with greater power to intervene, mediate, and respond to threats. America's post-war position: the U.S. emerged economically unscathed, unlike Europe and Asia. Its military was unmatched. It possessed the only nuclear arsenal. It became the leader of the Western world. But a new adversary loomed: the Soviet Union. World War II ended the Great Depression and cemented American superpower status. But it also set the stage for the Cold War, global decolonization, civil rights activism, and a battle for the soul of the 20th century. The Cold War begins, 1945 to 1960s. The victory in World War II came with a price: a divided world. Though allies in war, the United States and the Soviet Union quickly became enemies in ideology, influence, and ambition. The Cold War, not fought in trenches but in shadows, satellites, and strategies, would define the second half of the 20th century. It was a conflict of capitalism versus communism, freedom versus control, democracy versus dictatorship, fought across continents and within the American soul. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, 1947 to 1948. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman made a bold commitment to contain communism wherever it threatened free peoples. This became known as the Truman Doctrine. His first targets, Greece and Turkey, both threatened by Soviet-backed insurgencies. Truman asked Congress for $400 million in aid, declaring, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures." This was the birth of American containment policy, stopping communism's spread without direct war. Marshall Plan, 1948. Named for Secretary of State George C. Marshall, this economic recovery program gave over $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe, rebuilt industry, infrastructure, and agriculture, prevented economic collapse and communist influence. By 1952, Western Europe had surged back to life, while Eastern Europe, under Soviet control, languished behind the Iron Curtain. The Marshall Plan was not just aid, it was economic warfare with dollars. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The first military test of Cold War policy came on the Korean Peninsula. After World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later China. South Korea, supported by the US and the West. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded the South, aiming to reunify the country under communism. US response. Under the United Nations flag, but with American troops at the core, President Truman ordered a military response. General Douglas MacArthur led a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, cutting off the North Korean army. US forces advanced near the Yalu River, prompting China to enter the war with over 300,000 troops. A bloody stalemate followed. Over 36,000 Americans died, along with millions of Koreans and Chinese. In 1953, an armistice was signed, but no peace treaty. To this day, Korea remains divided and technically still at war. The Korean War marked the first major armed conflict of the Cold War, cemented US commitment to military containment, set precedent for presidential war powers without a formal declaration. McCarthyism and the Red Scare, 1950 to 1954. While the Cold War raged abroad, fear gripped the home front. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. China fell to communism under Mao Zedong the same year. In the US, this triggered a wave of suspicion, paranoia, and political repression known as the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, claimed, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 known communists in the State Department." Though no credible evidence ever surfaced, McCarthy led televised hearings accusing government officials, Hollywood actors and writers, teachers, union leaders, and army officers. Lives were ruined by blacklists, loyalty oaths, and baseless accusations. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, conducted aggressive investigations into alleged subversives. Even famed actors like Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, and Dalton Trumbo were blacklisted. The hysteria peaked in 1954 when McCarthy targeted the US Army. The Army McCarthy hearings, broadcast nationwide, exposed him as a bully without evidence. He was censured by the Senate, but the climate of fear had done its damage. Civil liberties were sacrificed in the name of national security, a pattern that would echo through future decades. The space race, Sputnik, and NASA, 1957 to 1960s. The Cold War wasn't just on the battlefield, it extended into space. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. It orbited Earth every 96 minutes. It sent radio signals Americans could hear. It caused panic. If they could launch a satellite, could they also launch nuclear missiles? American response. The National Defense Education Act, 1958, increased federal funding for science and math. In 1958, the US established NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Though the Soviets led early, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, 1961. The US launched Alan Shepard shortly after. The race to the moon was underway, driven by prestige, power, and paranoia. Space became a symbol of Cold War supremacy, not just scientific achievement, but ideological dominance. America's new global role. By the early 1960s, the United States was the world's strongest military power, a nuclear superpower, committed to containment, both by aid and by arms, internally conflicted over liberty, loyalty, and civil rights. The Cold War had reshaped foreign policy, education, surveillance, and society itself. And while the world waited to see who would win, America prepared for a new generation of challenges, both at home and abroad. The Civil Rights Movement, 1954 to 1968. For nearly a century after slavery ended, Black Americans remained second-class citizens, denied equal rights, equal access, and equal dignity. Jim Crow laws in the South enforced segregation by law. Redlining, voter suppression, police violence, and discrimination gripped the North as well. The Civil Rights Movement was not a moment. It was a generation-long uprising, led by students, clergy, women, workers, and visionaries, to fulfill the promise of the Constitution. Brown Fife, Board of Education, 1954. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously decided Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. The ruling declared separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. It overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, which had upheld separate but equal doctrine for decades. The Brown decision ordered the desegregation of public schools, but offered no timeline for compliance. Resistance was immediate and fierce. Little Rock 9, 1957. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black students enrolled in the all-white Central High School, testing the enforcement of Brown. Governor Orval Faubus deployed the Arkansas National Guard to block their entry. In response, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent federal troops from the 101st Airborne Division, the first time since Reconstruction that federal power enforced black civil rights in the South. The students endured daily harassment, threats, and violence, but they walked in and stayed. It was a national confrontation between states' resistance and federal authority. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old black seamstress and NAACP activist, refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus. She was arrested. In response, black leaders launched a citywide bus boycott, demanding equal seating rights. It lasted 381 days, crippling the city's transit system. At the center of the boycott was a 26-year-old Baptist minister, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He preached nonviolence, Christian justice, and civil disobedience, inspiring thousands. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation unconstitutional. Montgomery was the beginning, and King became the national face of a movement, Martin Luther King Jr., and nonviolent resistance. Dr. King led through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Freedom Rides, challenging segregated bus terminals, Birmingham Campaign, where children were jailed and attacked by dogs and fire hoses, March on Washington, 1963, where he delivered his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to over 250,000 people. King's philosophy drew from Gandhi's nonviolent resistance, the Bible, the Declaration of Independence. His dream was not just integration, but economic justice, equal opportunity, and dignity. Malcolm X and Black nationalism. But not all agreed with King's approach. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, was a fiery orator and minister of the Nation of Islam. He preached black self-reliance, racial pride, armed self-defense against white violence. He rejected integration as naive, calling for black empowerment on black terms. In his later years, after a pilgrimage to Mecca, Malcolm X softened his stance, emphasizing global human rights, but remained a powerful critic of American hypocrisy. He was assassinated in 1965, but his legacy influenced the rise of Black power and Pan-African consciousness. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, after years of marches, arrests, and beatings, and the shock of President John F. Kennedy's assassination, the pressure on Congress could no longer be ignored. Under President Lyndon B. Johnson, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. It banned discrimination in public places, prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, ended legal segregation in schools and facilities, created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EAOC. It was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. But black voters in the South still faced poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, violence, and closed doors. In Selma, Alabama, peaceful marchers attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7, 1965, a day known as Bloody Sunday, were brutally attacked by state troopers. National outrage followed. 5 months later, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. It banned literacy tests, required federal oversight in areas with a history of voter suppression, empowered the Justice Department to enforce black voting rights. In Mississippi, black voter registration jumped from 6% in 1965 to nearly 60% by 1969. A movement's sacrifice and continuing struggle. The civil rights movement made history, but it came with loss. Medgar Evers assassinated, 1963. Malcolm X assassinated, 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated in Memphis, 1968, while supporting striking sanitation workers. Their deaths marked the end of one chapter, but their lives laid the foundation for the next. The struggle expanded into education, housing, economic justice, prison reform, and cultural identity. The civil rights movement redefined America's moral compass, forcing the nation to confront its original sin and begin the work of redemption. Part 8. Modern America. Section A. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. By the early 1960s, the United States stood as a global superpower, committed to halting the spread of communism. No battlefield would test this resolve, or its limits, more than Vietnam. What began as a regional conflict would spiral into America's most controversial war, costing lives, credibility, and consensus. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident and Escalation, 1964. Vietnam had long been divided. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist revolutionary backed by China and the USSR. South Vietnam, backed by the US, with a fragile government dependent on American support. After years of advisors and military aid, the turning point came on August 2, 1964. The USS Maddox, on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, was reportedly attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. 2 days later, a second alleged attack occurred, though later evidence suggested it may never have happened. President Lyndon B. Johnson used the incident to request broad military authority. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack and to prevent further aggression. No formal war was declared, but American involvement escalated rapidly. By 1968, over 536,000 US troops were in Vietnam, a war unlike any other. The Vietnam War was not fought on traditional battlefields. Instead, it was a conflict of jungle warfare, guerrilla tactics by the Viet Cong, helicopter assaults and search and destroy missions, body counts instead of territory held. US forces dropped more bombs than in all of World War II combined, used napalm and Agent Orange, defoliants that poisoned landscapes and caused long-term health issues for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. Despite superior firepower, the US struggled to defeat an enemy that blended into the population. The Tet Offensive, 1968. On January 30th, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday of Tet, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a coordinated assault on more than 100 cities and military bases across South Vietnam, including the US Embassy in Saigon. Though the US and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks, the psychological impact was massive. Americans watching on TV saw that the war was far from over. It contradicted government claims that victory was near. Support for the war plummeted. Legendary news anchor Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam, declared, "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate not as victors, but as an honorable people." President Johnson, once confident, refused to seek re-election in 1968. Anti-war protests and a divided nation. At home, the Vietnam War tore the country apart. College campuses exploded in protest. Students for a Democratic Society led anti-war sit-ins. Demonstrations at Columbia, UC Berkeley, Kent State. Protesters burned draft cards, marched on Washington, and chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" On May 4th, 1970, at Kent State University, National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed student protesters. 4 students killed, 9 wounded. The tragedy ignited a nationwide student strike, the largest in US history. Artists, musicians, and public figures joined the movement. Muhammad Ali refused induction into the draft. Folk songs like "Fortunate Son" and "Blowin' in the Wind" became anthems of dissent. The war fractured generations, classes, and trust in government. The fall of Saigon and America's withdrawal, 1973 to 1975. In 1973, under President Richard Nixon, the US signed the Paris Peace Accords, initiating a ceasefire. The withdrawal of American troops, a promise of peace between North and South Vietnam. But fighting continued. On April 30th, 1975, 2 years after US withdrawal, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The American embassy evacuated by helicopter in scenes broadcast worldwide. Images of desperation, helicopters pushed off carriers and abandoned allies. It was the end of the Vietnam War and a symbol of American defeat. The cost of war. 58,220 American lives lost. Over 2 million Vietnamese civilian and military deaths. Tens of thousands wounded, missing, and psychologically scarred. Agent Orange and PTSD left deep health consequences. Veterans returned to a divided and ambivalent nation, often without honor or healing. The Vietnam War changed how America viewed military intervention, public trust in government. After revelations like the Pentagon Papers exposed deception, the limits of power in a complex, non-traditional conflict. And it left one lasting lesson. Technology and might cannot win what strategy and truth cannot justify. Watergate and political cynicism, 1970s to 1980s. The Vietnam War left behind more than fallen soldiers. It shattered faith in government, widened cultural divides, and exposed the limits of power. But even as troops returned home, a new crisis began. One that would forever alter the relationship between the American people and their leaders. It began with a break-in. It ended with the first and only resignation of a US president. The Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation, 1972 to 1974. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested trying to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Initially dismissed as a third-rate burglary, it soon became clear they were linked to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, known as CREAP, Committee to Re-elect the President. 2 reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, followed the money trail, uncovering a web of wiretapping, espionage against political enemies, obstruction of justice. Congress launched hearings. A special prosecutor was appointed. The turning point came when it was revealed that Nixon had secretly recorded all conversations in the Oval Office. Despite efforts to stonewall, the Supreme Court ordered the release of the tapes in U.S. v. Nixon, 1974. The tapes confirmed Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. Facing certain impeachment on August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned. "I have never been a quitter, but as president, I must put the interest of America first." Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency the next day. 1 month later, Ford granted Nixon a full pardon, sparking outrage and further deepening public distrust. The aftermath: a broken trust. Watergate shattered the illusion of presidential infallibility. It led to the War Powers Act, 1973, limiting presidential authority to wage war. Campaign finance reforms, greater media scrutiny of elected officials. But it also ushered in a new era of political cynicism. Americans increasingly distrusted Washington. Voter turnout declined. Faith in government institutions hit historic lows. In the 1970s, America experienced what many called a crisis of confidence, symbolized by stagflation, stagnant economic growth plus inflation. The oil crisis, gas lines and embargoes, the Iran hostage crisis, 1979. 52 Americans held for 444 days. President Jimmy Carter, elected in 1976, struggled to lead through this malaise. And into that vacuum stepped a new voice. Optimistic, forceful, and conservative. The rise of conservatism and the Reagan era, 1981 to 1989. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, a former actor and governor of California, won a landslide victory over Carter. Reagan offered a vision of confidence and simplicity. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. His domestic agenda included tax cuts, Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, deregulation of industries, cuts to social welfare programs, massive increases in defense spending. This philosophy became known as Reaganomics, or supply-side economics, based on the idea that reducing taxes and regulation would stimulate growth and trickle down to all levels of society. Critics noted that while inflation dropped and GDP rose, wealth inequality grew. The national debt tripled. Social safety nets were weakened. The gap between rich and poor widened sharply. Economic booms and busts, a volatile transition. Boom. The 1980s saw the rise of Wall Street wealth, consumer spending, and technological advancement. Personal computers, cable TV, and corporate mergers redefined business and culture. Unemployment dropped and confidence surged. Bust. In October 1987, the stock market crashed, known as Black Monday. The Dow Jones dropped 22.6% in one day, the largest single-day percentage drop in U.S. history. Though recovery was quick, it exposed the fragility of unregulated markets. Meanwhile, deindustrialization hit hard. Factories closed across the Midwest, creating the Rust Belt. Union power declined. Communities once fueled by steel, coal, and manufacturing were left behind. The economic transformations of the 1980s built a globalized economy, but one increasingly unequal and unstable, a shifting American identity. By the end of the 1980s, the Cold War was thawing, markets were booming. National pride had returned, but not for all. Watergate had taught Americans to question power. Reagan had taught them to reclaim pride. But beneath the surface lay unresolved questions about poverty, race, corporate influence, and global leadership. The end of the Cold War would bring both euphoria and uncertainty, and a new millennium would soon test America again. 9/11 and the War on Terror. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The US stood alone as the world's sole superpower, unmatched in military, economy, and influence. But on a clear Tuesday morning in September 2001, that sense of invincibility disappeared. It wasn't a foreign army. It wasn't nuclear war. It was 19 men armed with box cutters and fanaticism who changed America forever. September 11, 2001, the deadliest attack on US soil. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. At 9:03 a.m., United Flight 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Flight 77 slammed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. At 10:03 a.m., United Flight 93 crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers fought the hijackers. By 10:28 a.m., both towers had collapsed into rubble. The toll? 2,977 victims killed. Citizens from over 90 countries. 343 firefighters, 60 police officers, and 8 EMS personnel died in the rescue. It was the worst terrorist attack in world history. The mastermind, Osama bin Laden, leader of Al-Qaeda, a radical Islamic terrorist group based in Afghanistan under Taliban protection. The Patriot Act and the rise of domestic surveillance. In the weeks after the attacks, Congress passed the USAPATRIOT Act, short for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. Signed into law on October 26, 2001, it granted sweeping powers to law enforcement and intelligence agencies, including warrantless wiretaps, access to personal records without consent, secret surveillance of suspected individuals, even without formal charges. Supporters argued it was essential for preventing future attacks. Critics warned of civil liberties violations, racial profiling, and an erosion of privacy rights. Over time, it fueled debates about government overreach, mass data collection by the NSA, and the balance between security and freedom. War in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after 9/11, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The goal? Destroy Al-Qaeda. Remove the Taliban regime that harbored them. Capture or kill Osama bin Laden. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed. Al-Qaeda fled into mountainous tribal regions along the Afghan-Pakistan border. But what began as a swift retaliation became America's longest war. Key facts: US combat forces peaked at over 100,000 troops. Thousands of NATO and coalition soldiers deployed. Over 2,400 American service members killed. Over 47,000 Afghan civilians dead. Osama bin Laden remained at large until May 2, 2011, when he was killed by Navy SEAL Team 6 in Abbottabad, Pakistan, under President Barack Obama. In 2021, under President Joe Biden, the US fully withdrew after 20 years, and within weeks, the Taliban returned to power. Iraq War, 2003 to 2011, a war of choice. In March 2003, President George W. Bush launched an invasion of Iraq, asserting that dictator Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. He posed a threat to global security. He had ties to terrorist groups, later disproven. Operation Iraqi Freedom began with a shock and awe bombing campaign. Within 3 weeks, Baghdad fell, but no WMDs were ever found. Fallout, a brutal insurgency followed. Sunni-Shia sectarian violence escalated into civil war. The group ISIS, Islamic State, emerged from the chaos years later. Over 4,400 American troops killed, tens of thousands wounded. Iraqi civilian deaths estimated at over 200,000. Though Saddam Hussein was captured, tried, and executed in 2006, the war divided global allies, cost the U.S. over $2 trillion, eroded public trust in government intelligence and motives. The Department of Homeland Security, a new frontier. In response to September 11th, the federal government underwent its largest reorganization since World War II. In 2002, Congress created the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Combining 22 federal agencies, DHS became responsible for border protection, immigration enforcement, cybersecurity, airport screening, TSA, domestic counterterrorism, impacted millions of travelers subject to new TSA procedures. U.S. immigration policy shifted toward security over openness. The no-fly list and visa vetting tightened dramatically. Color-coded terror alerts became part of daily life. Homeland Security became a permanent feature of post-9/11 America, symbolizing a nation redefined by fear, vigilance, and resilience. A nation transformed. September 11th and the War on Terror changed. U.S. foreign policy, national security laws, immigration and surveillance practices, and the very psychology of American identity. A generation grew up with airport pat-downs, active shooter drills, and 2 wars overseas. While Osama bin Laden was killed and Al-Qaeda weakened, the War on Terror introduced endless war, digital surveillance, and moral dilemmas the nation still grapples with. The scars remain, the questions endure. Part 9. Division and Democracy. 21st Century Politics. The 21st century began with terror and war, but in 2008, Americans turned a page, electing a leader whose very presence challenged centuries of exclusion. The Obama presidency, 2009 to 2017. On January 20th, 2009, Barack Hussein Obama was sworn in as the 44th President of the United States, and the first African American to hold the office. A constitutional law professor, former community organizer, and U.S. Senator, Obama's election symbolized hope and historic change. Key policies and achievements: Affordable Care Act, 2010, expanded health insurance to over 20 million Americans, banned denial for pre-existing conditions. Dodd-Frank Act, reformed Wall Street after the 2008 financial crisis. Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, addressed gender wage discrimination. Repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing LGBTQ+ service members to serve openly. Ordered the Navy SEAL mission that killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize, but also oversaw drone strikes, struggled with gridlock, and faced fierce partisan opposition. His presidency sparked a right-wing backlash, including the rise of the Tea Party movement, and exposed the truth. Representation doesn't equal reconciliation. Social media and election influence. The 2010s saw the rise of social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, that redefined how Americans got their news, debated politics, organized protests, spread misinformation. In the 2016 presidential election, Russian operatives used fake accounts and targeted ads to inflame divisions, spread false narratives, and undermine public trust in democracy. Algorithms favored outrage, echo chambers grew, and disinformation became a weapon of mass disruption. U.S. The Trump Era and Populist Surge, 2016 to 2020. In November 2016, Donald J. Trump, a billionaire real estate mogul and television personality, defeated former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Running on the slogans "Make America Great Again" and "Drain the Swamp," Trump channeled populist energy, economic anxiety, and cultural resentment. His presidency was marked by massive tax cuts and deregulation, hardline immigration policies, including family separations at the border, tariff wars with China, Withdrawal from global agreements. Paris Climate Accord. Iran nuclear deal. 2 impeachments. First over Ukraine pressure, second for incitement of insurrection. To his supporters, Trump was a disruptor of elite consensus. To his critics, a threat to truth, norms, and democracy. January 6, 2021, the Capitol riot. On January 6, 2021, as Congress met to certify Joe Biden's electoral victory, a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol. 5 people died. Over 140 police officers injured, lawmakers evacuated, certification temporarily halted. The Confederate flag appeared inside the Capitol for the first time in U.S. history. It was the first violent transfer of power attempt in modern American history. Trump was impeached for incitement, but acquitted by the Senate. It left a scar and a question. Can a democracy survive when its own citizens reject its results? The American experiment, still being tested. Immigration debates. Throughout U.S. history, immigration has shaped identity and sparked division. 21st century debates intensified over border security and asylum rights. Undocumented immigrants, including DACA recipients, dreamers. Muslim travel bans and refugee caps. America remains a beacon, but also a gatekeeper. The central question endures: who belongs in We the People? Climate policy and environmental challenge. As wildfires, hurricanes, and droughts intensified, so did calls for action. Paris Climate Accord, 2015. Global commitment to reduce emissions. Green New Deal proposal. Ambitious plan for sustainable jobs and energy. Keystone Pipeline debates. Fossil fuel versus renewable investment. The science is clear, the politics remain divided. Climate change became a test not just of innovation, but of will. Gun rights and the Second Amendment. Mass shootings. In Sandy Hook, Parkland, Uvalde, Las Vegas, sparked nationwide grief and political stalemate. The Second Amendment guaranteed the right to bear arms, but Americans were dying by the thousands each year from gun violence. Despite overwhelming public support for background checks and restrictions, gridlock prevailed. Guns became symbols of liberty and fear. Culture, wars, and political polarization. Issues once confined to debate halls spilled into the streets. Black Lives Matter and protests after the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. Transgender rights, LGBT plus protections, and gender identity debates. Book bans, school curriculums, and the rise of anti-woke campaigns. Abortion rights, including the 2022 overturning of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court. Cable news, social media, and partisan media outlets amplified division. Truth became relative, facts became politicized. Yet across the divide, a shared fear echoed. Is America tearing itself apart, or rewriting what unity means? The American idea. For over 2 centuries, the United States has been a nation of contradiction, a republic founded on freedom, built by enslaved hands, a beacon of democracy, marred by exclusion, a dream of equality, chased by generations who never found it, and yet, the pursuit continued. From the Iroquois Confederacy to the Continental Congress, from Seneca Falls to Selma, from Gettysburg to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, from Stonewall to Standing Rock, Americans have fought not just for power, but for principle. Not just to preserve the past, but to forge the future. This is a nation born in revolution, matured through struggle, and held together, barely, defiantly, by a belief that we are not finished. The American story is not perfect, but it is unfinished. And now, the question is not where we've been, but what will the next chapter be?